Welcome back to the program. We've got State Representative Rick Beck on the line. He's from District 65. Rick, how are you, sir?
Fine. Good to talk to you this morning, Paul.
Man, it's good to talk to you, as always. So how are things going in this interim, where there's no session going on? Are you making it okay?
Yeah, it's nice to have a bit of a break, although I don't know that people fully understand that. We do meet in committees and getting things together. And yesterday, we were working on some with the Education Committee related to the funding, the foundation funding for our education system.
Really? Well, so how's that how's that going? I mean, are there people considering making changes?
Yes. First of all, your viewers might be, or your listeners may be interested in hearing that education, K through 12 education, is about $3 billion of the general revenue expenditures, which is over 40% of the general revenue that actually goes towards education. The legislators are challenged with coming up with what is an adequate education. And then once we determine what an adequate education is as far as categories of education and so on and so forth, then by law we are mandated to fund it. You might have heard people say that, this is going to take away from education or whatever, and that's just not a true case because education is funded first. So education is never shorted because of funding of something else. Wow. But anyway, one of the things that we're trying to work on right now is what's called the matrix. There's a portion of the education funding that's called the foundation funding, and this is the amount that's given to each one of the school districts. Now, foundation funding is based upon really head count, so the number of students you have times the foundation funding amount equals the amount of disbursement you're going to get from the state. Now, foundation funding is only a portion. It represents about 60 to 70% of the funding that a school district would get. The way we determine foundation funding, the amount of the foundation funding, is we use what's called a matrix, and that's what we're working on right now, to try to maybe adjust the matrix to try to find out whether or not to get this thing up to date. We really haven't updated it in the last 16 years or so. So what the matrix is it's a component-by-component matrix of what it takes for education, including salaries for teachers, nurses, principals, technology, books, and so on and so forth. So everything is put into the matrix, and then once we determine all of those components, we then come up with this foundation funding, which is a amount that we pay per student. Last year, that amount was $6,781 per student. Now, that's the very basic, like I said, foundation minimum you would get. Most schools would get quite a bit more than that per student.
Yeah.
Probably more. Arkansas's average, I believe, is somewhere around about $8,500 after we put other adders. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to look at the matrix and say, okay, what items might want to pull out of the matrix that are no longer relevant, and what items do we need to put into the matrix? This will allow us to better fund schools. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily more, not necessarily less, but better align our actual expenditures with what the schools are actually doing.
So you're saying once you figure out, essentially, like this is a part of a process to figure out what the state considers, or what you guys, representatives of the people, what you guys consider to be an adequate education. And then after you decide whatever that definition is, whatever the parameters of that look like, then it has to be funded.
Yes. Wow. And we've done a good job of that. It's interesting. One of the things that the matrix, going back to the matrix, and one of the tweaks I think that we have to come up with based upon the expenditures of the school districts. It's interesting to know that we do not give up local control. Once we determine what this foundation funding is, then that amount of money, if you can envision, is basically just pushed through a pipe, and at the other end of that pipe is your local school board and your superintendent. Just because we allocated money for one component in the matrix does not mean that money has to be spent on that component. That's up to local control, which is your school board and your superintendent.
Yeah.
So some interesting things is on the foundation funding, approximately about $4,700 of that goes to teacher salary. So out of the $6,700 of the foundation funding, about $4,700 of that is actually goes to salaries for teachers.
Interesting. We're talking with State Representative Rick Beck from District 65. Remind everybody where District 65 is again, Rick.
District 65 is pretty much all of Conway County and part of Perry County. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump back into the matrix here for just a second. One of the things that we've determined in the matrix is that in the matrix as it stands right now, the number of personnel to students, there are 14 students for every one personnel. That's just the way it works out in the matrix as it is now. But if you actually look at your school districts, your listeners may be surprised to find out that it's much lower than that. In some cases, it's down as much as to 6 to 1. So 6 students to every one person working at that school. Now that includes bus drivers and things like that. So we have to consider that. But those numbers are much lower, and as they are, it really messes up the foundation funding, because when we're funding at a ratio of 14 students to one salary. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking real close at.
Interesting. And so you think it could be more efficient if you kind of adjust that?
I think I think that's exactly what I'm hoping to get out of this. I'm hoping that by adjusting the matrix, we can actually truly align the matrix with what the schools are spending it on, and then let's take a look at those individual components. Right? Is there something there that we're doing? Maybe it's something that the state's requiring a school district to do that really doesn't amount to much, and it's not worth what the old saying, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on that. So maybe we would eliminate that requirement off the school district in the hopes of gaining some efficiency out in the districts themselves.
Yeah. Can you give us a little update in your neck of the woods? I mean, how did the flooding affect y'all's area when we had those terrible flooding in the spring?
Well, we were. It was very close. We did very well. We had a problem with one of the levees. It was an old pipe that had been run under the levee years and years ago. Actually, as a matter of fact, we had a hard time finding out exactly what the size of the pipe was, and it gave us some leakage problems. But we were able to actually build a dam on the back side of the levee to contain that water right there, so to prevent flooding. So that was a great effort by the locals here in my district. The other thing that happened is actually happened when the waters were receding. We had a levee district that held up very well. The levee did exactly what it was supposed to do, and I can tell you it's pretty frightening when you're standing on top of that levee and you're looking at a foot or so, and the water's coming over top, and this thing is holding, and but the levees held. But actually, when the waters receded, because of the amount of water, we actually suffered some damage to one of the levees. Now, it never gave in, but it's going to be some extensive repair on that levee.
So talk a little bit about that, because there are, we have the governor and other legislators, who are on looking into this. Legislators appointed to, I guess, a study group. Then you also have potential federal dollars that'll come in. You would assume, to try to help some of these, to try to help repair some of these levees, or maybe even make them stronger so this doesn't happen again.
Well, I think there are a lot of components out there that we have to look at. I think we will certainly get a lot of federal dollars, or get federal dollars. The amount I do not know, but to repair the levees, to get them back up to where they're supposed to be. But the other thing that this flood has done, it's like the old roof thing, right? No one cares about the roof until it rains, right? But this flood has shown us that maybe we got to take a closer look at some of the maintenance of our levees. So I think that's the task force that you're talking about. I think that's one of the things they're going to be challenged with, is looking at the maintenance side, the ongoing maintenance. After we get these things back up into shape, how are we going to maintain them? Where's that funding going to come from? Is it going to be a local tax on the protected lands for the levees? Is it going to be state funded? What's that going to look like? It'll probably, my guess is it'll probably be a mixture of both. It'll be local funding, by those areas protected by the levees, and then the other part of it would be that we get some from the state. And that's the task force to determine exactly how that's going to work out.
Is there a lot of animosity with the folks in your district and surrounding districts that, either almost got wiped out or did get wiped out by the people upriver? I think the Army Corps of Engineers took a lot of heat for releasing the water when they did. In what was that, Oklahoma?
Yes, and that's one thing that I would like to talk a little bit about, actually. One of the things that happened is, people say, well, Oklahoma released this water on us and it cost us money. It's worth noting that this situation was such that there were heavy rains up in that area. The reservoirs up there were full. They were already in a mode in Oklahoma. It's interesting to know that in Oklahoma, when their reservoirs get full, what they start to do is they start to release water. And they actually gauge the amount of water that they release off of the flow of the river at Fort Smith. And they try to set that up to 573 million cubic feet per second, and which is what the river can hold. As far as normally, the normal flow of the river is around 60,000 cubic feet per second. But so they take it up to that high level, which is a manageable level, to try to get their reservoirs empty. And they were actually in that mode doing that when they just had a catastrophic rain in that area. And they really had no choice but to let the water come down the river.
Wow.
I've heard a lot of people saying that, they released the water on us. It's like, this was an event that, Now, I will say this. We have had some meetings, and we're looking at, let's take a look. Maybe they should have gone into this release mode a little bit earlier, and that had a little bit more room in the reservoirs and things. But if you really look at the numbers, it just looks like that was it was a very tough event, weather event. So we're looking at how we can possibly do that to make it actually work better in the future. Maybe there's some procedural type things that we can do, and possibly maybe there is some reservoirs or something like that we can take a look at.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, you don't really get these types of conflicts between states very often, or at least, I can't remember. I'm sure it's happened before, but it's one of those. It's like you kind of say it's a catch-22, and obviously the folks up in Oklahoma, they don't want to get flooded, so they'll just, it's just kind of one of those things. And you also kind of wonder, would Oklahoma, of course I know it was the Army Corps of Engineers, so I don't know, but would the federal government need to pay for some of these repairs, or is Oklahoma responsible, or, these are all questions that I hear people asking.
If you go back to the history of the levees, who built the levees, why they were built, and it's a pretty interesting. The levees started out with farmers basically building levees to protect their land by the river. And it expanded, and then the Corps came in and built levees. And then for a period there, the Corps actually maintained the levees. And then at one point, we wanted local control over the levees. So the Corps gave us local controls, and with these levee boards, they mandated that we set up what's called levee boards, or individuals that maintain the maintenance. They also have the ability to assess taxes against individuals that are protected by the levees to keep those levees in shape. And what happened is, for the most part, most levee boards did exactly what they were supposed to do. There were some that did not. And those are some weak parts of our levee that we got to take care of. One of the things that we're looking at here in Conway County, which I think is going to be a good thing in the long run, is we're looking at maybe reducing the number of levee boards, making the area larger for the levees. As far as, instead of having 6 levee boards, let's just have 1 or maybe 2 levee boards that comprise of a larger group, so that we can more continuity there. Because quite honestly, if you have 8 levee districts and 7 of them are in great shape and one of them's not, The other 7 really don't matter, do they?
Yeah.
Because the one is going to, and so that's the type thing that we're looking at doing. I think that task force is going to look at that too. Is what's the best way to do that? We actually have, if you think about this, we actually have levies board for a levy, a single continuous levy that might have as many as 7 levy boards for the different sections of it. And I think that if you're a continuous levy section, there should be one board for that.
Yeah.
And for the full levy.
Yeah. Hey,
now another issue that's very interesting that I have heard some concerns with farmers is this. A lot of individuals farm between the levees and the river. Right now, those are unprotected areas, obviously, and there's some issues there with farmers saying, well, okay, we can't get crop insurance. We're unprotected. So how do you handle that? Quite honestly, you chose to farm between the levees and the river, so there's obviously an accelerated risk there. But at the same time, the farmers do feed us, so we have to figure out how exactly we're going to handle that. And that's a major issue.
That's a good point too. That's a good point.
There's some fields that there's 6 feet of sand, 4 feet of sand on top of what was once a low crop field. Those fields may never, ever be returned back to production because hauling 6 foot of sand off of a 40-acre field is a pretty big task.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Rick, I appreciate you coming on. I got one last question for you. So when you're seated in the Arkansas House of Representatives, I believe you sit between State Representative Dan Sullivan and John Payton, and you're 1 seat away from Josh Miller. How do you stand it?
Well, we kind of sit back there, and I don't know. It's a great group. We're back there on the back row. I don't know what that means either, but it's just a great group of people. And I tell you what, I do listen and take to their advice quite a bit back there. And they're a lot of fun to have. It's what we call seatmates, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, I appreciate it, sir. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks for spending some time with us this morning.
You bet. Anytime, Paul. Just give me a call.
All righty. Yes, sir. Rick Beck, everybody. State Representative, District 65.